Hello, this is the ramblings of an Indisciplined Mind podcast for Friday, November 4th, 2016. So Friday is review day where I talk about something that I've read or I've watched. And one of the books that I recently finished was the wife had picked up on Kindle, and we get to share our Kindle acquisitions. The Man in the High Castle by Phillip K. And it's topical right now because there is an Amazon show about this, of which we've watched the first episode. And so the basic premise is the Axis powers won World War II. It sounds like Italy seceded from the Axis at one point and tried to fall in with the Allies. It didn't help. Not terribly surprising. So the United States has been carved up, and you've got the Pacific States, which are now called the Pacific States of America, or PSA. Those are under Japanese control. And then you've got I think it's supposed to be like kind of from the Midwest over to the East Coast. That is controlled by Nazi Germany. And there's this little chunk in the middle that's like the Rocky Mountain states that are apparently the last bastion of free America that doesn't fall under either one. And so the book has got 3 or 4 main characters. And it predominantly takes place... Well, it takes place in the PSA, and it takes place a little bit in the Rocky Mountain states. So you've got... The main characters are a Japanese trade minister whose name I forget, who's stationed in San Francisco. You've got this guy by the name of Frank Frick, who is probably a Jew in hiding, whose last name is really Fink. And you've got another American by the name of Robert Childan, I believe was his name. And you've got, I think it was Janine Frick, who was Frank's wife, and then there's some guy that's supposed to be Swedish that's visiting from Europe, visiting to see the trade minister guy. So they all kind of are living separate little lives. So Frank Frick, he works for a company that makes knockoff pieces of Americana. So knockoff, Civil War revolvers and things that there's really nobody alive anymore that can authenticate easily. It's not as easy as going down to the pawn shop, because there is a healthy trade in Americana items among the Japanese. They are very interested in that, and they like pieces that supposedly have Horace. What was the word he used? And I thought that can't be a word, and it was. It's historicity or something like that. Historicity. I don't know. I'd have to look it up. But it basically means it is is when something has a bit of historical significance about it, kind of inherent in it. So obviously a World War II pistol, that would be the case. And so he's making that, but he's unhappy working there. He's been working for this big company that's just churning this crap out. And he's unhappy with it. So he and another guy that worked there, they decide to go and make their own jewelry company. and try to go out on business of their own. They get a bit of a payoff from their old boss, and that's their starting stake, if you will. And so then they're trying to gear up and start this company. And then you've got this guy by the name of Robert Childan, and he runs a business that's called, I believe it was American Artifacts. And so he's selling these items that are supposedly from various periods of American history. And he's got a lot of large Japanese clientele, and he's selling this stuff. And it's what was funny about this guy, from a writing perspective. You hear, and there's a number of things about this book. It was written in 1963, I think. There are a number of things about this book that would probably make it immensely unpopular today if it was written today. There was a line at one point I pointed out to the wife that was basically saying that women were really only good for decoration, and I was like, wow, I don't know that would fly very well today. And the other thing it would probably be derided as inappropriate now, but it did kind of point out a point. So this Robert Childan guy, he is a Caucasian. He's not Japanese descent, but he's trying. That's his customer base. So he tries to ingratiate himself to them. And so when I noticed it first in his speech patterns. If you ever heard the stereotypical, and I don't know that this is how people that are just learning the language actually talk, but this is certainly the stereotype. So the stereotype, Asian learning English is that they drop a lot of pronouns, and you get these really short, choppy sentences, where it's like, go to store, pick up bread, kind of thing, and I noticed he was actually having dinner with this Japanese couple, and they were talking like that, and I noticed that so was he. And after that, I noticed he even thought like that when they were showing interior monologue for this guy. It was in these little choppy sentences that were missing words, missing pronouns. And I thought that was interesting. It was an interesting way of kind of showing that he is so focused on, his Japanese overlords, so to speak, that, he's even changing how he talks and changing how he thinks to match up with what he thinks he needs to do to be able to ingratiate himself to them. So I thought that was kind of interesting. It was an interesting... It was an interesting literary tool. Like I say, I don't think that would be an appropriate one really to use today. You'd have to do something different, but I don't know how you would pull that off. That would be kind of interesting to see. And then you've got Janine Frick, I think that was her last name. And she falls in with, she is left Frank because he's boring, and she has escaped to the Rocky Mountain States in Denver to be, or not, it wasn't Denver, I don't think, but it was in Colorado. It was in Colorado. And she's like teaching judo at a little gym in this little town. And she falls in with this guy that was riding shotgun on a truck, and they have an affair, and he introduces her to this book. So all throughout this story, characters are reading this book called, I forget what it is, like The Grasshopper Jumps High. It's The Grasshopper something. I think that's it. And it is a book that is telling the story of what would happen if Germany and the rest of the Axis powers had lost World War II. And it basically tells the story, for the most part, of our history as we know it. And as you can imagine, it's kind of looked at as a curiosity in the PSA because the Japanese government isn't quite so nuts. The German government has outlawed it and has even, supposedly threatened to kill this guy. And so that's where the name comes from. Supposedly the author for this, he's living, I think it was in Cheyenne, Colorado, and he is supposedly living in this, fortified house that's, like by itself on a hill, barbed wire, can't get in, and it's called the High Castle. So therefore, he's the man in the High Castle. So, what's kind of interesting about this is there's a lot going on with like Frank and with Robert where they're trying to, you get to see a lot of, and with the trade minister, where you get to see a lot of how the Japanese workings of the government and how they treat the Caucasians that they're now occupying, or the peoples that you're now occupying. I mean, this is basically whether you're either Japanese or you're white is basically how it sounds. In reality, that wouldn't be the case. You got Janine, she's got this guy that she's fallen in with, and they decided to take a trek up to visit the High Castle, to visit the author. And then the trade minister gets embroiled in this plot. This Swedish visitor needs to have a three-way meeting between the trade minister himself and then this other mysterious gentleman that's coming across by boat from Japan, from the home islands. And that's kind of the setup. There's really not a definitive plot per se, and there's a lot that is left unresolved. So it's almost more like a slice of life. There is one large threat that gets revealed in the second third of the book that, other than raising an alarm, nothing is resolved one way or the other about that large threat. We see stuff going on with Frank's business, but we're not really sure is that going to be a success or not. We're not really sure what's going on with his estranged wife afterwards. So there's a lot not resolved. It's kind of an interesting. It's got a very unique feel to it. Being written in the 60s. You're kind of taking this premise that the Axis powers have won the World War, but it really kind of feels like it's over, and that would be bleak. But I almost felt like kind of the bleak mindset, and maybe that's what kind of inspired him to take up this topic, was I really kind of felt like he had the bleakness of the Cold War kind of going on underneath it, and that does relate to the threat a little bit that I mentioned earlier. So it was kind of interesting because we got this bad situation where the United States is divvied up, and the Germans are now running most of the world, and they're pretty much rabid dogs, and they're having a power struggle, but internally, that is. But to me, I could kind of feel like what I imagine Philip K. Dick was feeling himself about the Cold War that was pretty hot and heavy in the early 1960s and beyond. So yeah, it was an interesting read. There are some differences with the Amazon show. The most striking is it's not a book. it's actually a newsreel that this guy supposedly put together. And of course, it uses real footage from our history of, the Germans having lost the war, and it shows, the swastika getting blown up off the I think it's the Reichstag building, and all these things. They might, so it shows all that, and that kind of gives it a different feel, because now you're almost looking at a window in an alternate world when you're seeing video like that. It's a little different looking, different feeling, I think, than reading a novel. Although there is an interesting thing that happens at the end that kind of might parlay into that whole thought process again. So maybe that's why they chose to go video. They actually show a woman running, holding a big, reel of video in her arms for the cover of the book as a tie-in to the Amazon show. But we watched the show. I don't remember a lot of the storylines overlapping. The kind of the main events. It's been a little while since we watched it, but the main events that I remember didn't necessarily directly correlate. So they might be there. It might be I just wasn't remembering, or it might be that they're going to come out in later episodes. So we'll have to go back to that at some point. But it was an interesting read. If you're interested in that kind of thing, check it out. The Man in the High Castle by Phillip K. Dick. But I am really, really long today, so I'm going to stop. I should be back tomorrow, and I'll be talking to you then. So, be seeing you.